All right, good afternoon, everyone. This is Chris Boyd, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's webinar. So the webinar is going to be titled Presenting the Galveston Bay Shoreline Protection Model. And I'm just going to show my face here for a couple minutes, and then I'm going to make an introductory presentation. So if you would, make sure to put if you're using a cell phone, make sure to put it on mute. And also on the GoToMeeting, if you would just mute yourself as well. And we're just going to have questions at the very end. I'll go over the agenda in just a minute. So if you would just text any questions to me, the organizer, and then at the very end we'll have hopefully at least 15 minutes to go over some of the questions. So again, my name's Chris Boyd, and I will make this first introductory presentation. I'm going to turn off my video real quick and then start this PowerPoint. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to be presenting the Galveston Bay Shoreline Protection Model today, and this is actually funded as a larger project through the NOAA Restore Science Program. So essentially, I am the lead PI for this project. We have created 3 living shoreline suitability models for the Gulf of Mexico, and I'll present a little bit more information about that here in just a minute. But one of the living shoreline suitability models, or being called the Shoreline Protection Model, is for Galveston Bay. Essentially, the Virginia Institute of Marine Science Living Shoreline Suitability Model, or Shoreline Management Model, has been used for this project, and we'll talk more about that here in just a minute. So again, make sure to turn your cell phone on mute and your audio on silent on the GoToMeeting website. And again, send any questions that you might have for myself or the other presenters, and we will make sure to go over those at the very end. And what we do not have time to answer, we will email the questions answered for you in the next couple days. And I am recording this webinar, and then the Galveston Bay Foundation will actually email the webinar link to you here in the next day or two. So the presenters today are myself, Leanne Wilde from the Galveston Bay Foundation. She's the Living Shoreline Program Manager. Marcia Berman works for the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, where she's the Director of a Comprehensive Coastal Inventory Program. Haley Lehi is works for the Galveston Bay Foundation as well. She's the Habitat Restoration Manager and also a GIS professional. Tammy Runicki is the GIS programmer and analyst for the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. So these presenters are going to be going over the following presentations. So again, I'm going to make a short introductory presentation. Marcia Berman is going to give basically a background and development of living shoreline siting tools, going through some of the history. Leanne Wilde will talk about the Galveston Bay Foundation's role in shoreline protection in Galveston Bay. Haley Lehi will be presenting the Galveston Bay Shoreline Protection Model. She'll be doing it online, so you will be looking at it interactively. Tammy Runicki will be presenting the Living Shoreline Decision Support Tool in an interactive training as well. And then what time we have left, we will answer any questions that you all have. So again, thanks so much for joining this webinar today. Again, this is a part of a NOAA Restore Act Science Program project. It started somewhere around June 1st, 2017, and it will be completed by December of this year. So the other co-PIs, again, are Marcia Berman, Steve Jones from Geological Survey of Alabama. Steve Jones is in charge of the Coastal Alabama Living Shoreline Suitability Model. Sutong Nu also works for Troy University like myself, and he is in charge of the Lake Pontchartrain GIS for the suitability model for Lake Pontchartrain, and Leanne Wilde for the Galveston Bay Foundation. And here are some of my project partners. So the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, Louisiana Sea Grant Law and Policy Program, and the Gulf of Mexico Alliance. Really do not have a whole lot of time for my introductory presentation, but really this project, we thought to apply for this project because we had used the Virginia Institute of Marine Science Living Shoreline Suitability Model version 3 for Mobile Bay that was funded by the Gulf of Mexico Alliance. I think that was funded between 2014 and 2016. So myself and Steve Jones were a part of that project along with some other co-PIs, but we wanted to implement it in different portions of the Gulf. The Gulf of Mexico Alliance actually funded one for Tampa Bay as well about the time this project was funded. So we just wanted to see how well the model needed to be changed for different geographic regions around the Gulf. The different project deliverables is mainly what I'm going to go over here, and then I'm going to turn it over to Marcia. But essentially, we're creating 3 living shoreline site suitability models for the Gulf. So again, it's for coastal Alabama. Mainly it's for areas below Mobile Bay, so up near Ono Island, in the tidal waters above Orange Beach and Gulf Shores, and Wolf Bay, and some other areas. The living shoreline suitability models are really designed, in my opinion, to assist with homeowners, permitting agencies, planners, and other contractors. I just wanted to make a side note that each water body area did have a shoreline advisory board, living shoreline advisory board, to really make sure that we had buy-in for the different models, so that they can make comments along the way, so that once the models do go live, that everyone's happy with it and they would be used. Tammy Renicki and Marcia Berman will go over the Living Shoreline Decision Support Tool in more detail here in just a minute. So that was actually the second part of the project. The models will be made available at NCEI and also on NOAA's Geo Platform website here in the somewhat near future towards the end of this project. So basically that's one place where the viewers can be found. The last 2 deliverables were the creation of a shoreline management model handbook. So actually the model that the different water bodies are using right now is version 5.1 that Virginia Institute of Marine Science has published. They have also written this handbook, so it's going to allow others with GIS capabilities to basically download the model and to be able to create one for different areas around the United States. And then finally, we conducted workshops to showcase these different suitability models and all the other water body regions, in the Gulf that are presented. And this is really the last one, and we're hosting it via webinar due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And due to time, I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to Marcia. I'm just going to present 2 more slides here. This is showing you some different areas where you can find the viewers. So really you can find the Tampa Bay Living Shoreline Suitability Viewer at that website, and I will make some of this information available to the participants. Geological Survey of Alabama houses the suitability models at present time for the state of Alabama. And then Lake Pontchartrain will be made available through NOAA and at a website being taken care of by Sutong New at Troy University. So I will just go ahead and turn over the presentation to Marcia at this time.
All right. So thanks everyone for joining. Thank you, Leanne and Haley, for really organizing this. And despite the circumstances, we have a great turnout. And so we appreciate that very much. I think if we had done this in person, we would have had a much smaller turnout. So happy to reach a broader audience. So for the next 20 minutes, I guess, I'm going to talk to you some background about the 2 models that we have been working on in this project. And I will introduce Tammy Rudnicki as my kind of co-author on this project from the VIMS perspective. And Tammy is actually really has done all the technical work for both of these tools that I'm going to show you, and she will demonstrate one of the tools at the end of the webinar. So the VIM's role in this project has really been to provide the model code for the living shoreline suitability model and to provide technical assistance to the various partners in the proposed study area teams. And Chris mentioned those. That would be Galveston Bay, Lake Pontchartrain, and Mobile Bay. Our second role was to develop this interactive decision support tool, which I'll talk more about. And then finally, to develop a user guide that was designed for GIS professionals in order to enable individuals to implement the model in other regions. So first, I'll kind of kick it off with a description of what this suitability model is. So it is a GIS or geospatial model that runs in ArcGIS, and it delineates shoreline best management practices with a preference for nature-based solutions for erosion control. And it was originally developed to provide guidance for implementation of Virginia's living shoreline policy back in 2011. It's been through several iterations, and its current version is 5.1, and the various partners have updated their models to version 5.1 at this time. So Chris mentioned that really the original intended users for this were those who worked in shoreline management, whether it was through regulatory boards or agencies, whether they were contractors who were trying to develop a capacity to build living shorelines and needed a better idea of where they were suitable, and also for private citizens to enable them to make better decisions about how to manage their properties. As time's gone on, there's been sort of an expanded vision for the suitability model and for application, and we have found it, and we are using it currently in Virginia for planning for community resilience, so where are living shorelines appropriate and provide resilience capacity. This is particularly of interest to local planners and county engineers, and also for identifying BMPs for potential TMDL credits. And again, this is useful for both local planners, state agencies, and those doing stormwater management. So in order for the model to run in any area, it does require a relatively robust geospatial database that brings a lot of information or attributes that characterize the condition of the coastal landscape. And so for most of these regions in this project, they have spent considerable time developing that geospatial database to support the model run. The model itself actually follows decision tree logic that we've developed here in Virginia for improving on-site assessments to assist with regulatory permit review of tidal shorelines. So here on the left, you can see an example of what one of these logic models actually looks like. And this is the flow chart that's been interpreted for the shoreline management model, or the living shoreline suitability model. And so this is, the model itself actually has three separate modules, and this is one of them for undefended shoreline. And there's also another section of the model that you can't see here that goes to shorelines that have existing bulkheads or shorelines that have already been hardened with revetments. So we're characterizing potential erosion control methods or modeling potential erosion control methods for shorelines that have been both undefended and currently defended. And so what you can see is that there are outputs of various types, and that on the right-hand side is sort of a representation of this flow chart in the GIS model building world. And ultimately, the outcome of this would be to develop an interface for the end user to be able to visualize what these recommendations might look like. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on this in a bit. So the model has 10 different classifications that are roughly organized into three major categories. So BMPs that would be classified as true living shorelines, they may be structural or they may be hybrid, such as planting marshes with sills. In Virginia, we do include offshore breakwaters as long as it comes along with beach nourishment as a living shoreline BMP. The model also recognizes that living shorelines are not appropriate everywhere, and so there are traditional structures that are output as a recommended erosion control option for areas where living shorelines are not suitable. And the model also recognizes that some areas are just a little too complex to make a finite decision or recommendation. They may be areas that have ecological conflicts, where there may be regulatory issues associated with permitting or construction on site. These, for example, would be areas that have SAV or mangroves. They may be areas that are highly modified, such as a very commercial industrial wharf area, or there may be areas that have kind of some unusual geomorphic features, such as spits or tombolos. And of course, there's also the opportunity that there may be no action necessary, and there are some formations, such as marsh islands, that would kind of fall under that category. So in front of you here is the classification that we're using in version 5.1. So ultimately, you want to deliver your product to the end user. And I just thought I'd show you that in Virginia, we have a comprehensive coastal resource management portal where the end user, the data is actually organized by locality. So each locality has its own portal. I'm not going to show you any details, but I thought I would show you an example of what our viewer looks like. This is for the city of Hampton. As you can see, it's a very urbanized area, but it also has a very kind of a mix of shoreline types. And so in this particular area, you've got more open Chesapeake Bay, higher energy shoreline out here, and then you have some more sheltered shorelines. So the way the model will work here, or the tool works, is that the user can go in and click on a piece of shoreline, and a little window will pop up that gives you the best management practice. And for this area, as you can see, this is a relatively low energy shoreline. The recommendation here was for a non-structural living shoreline. If you went to one of the more outer edges of Hampton, which is a higher energy area, the recommendation here was to maintain the beach area or to construct an offshore breakwater with beach nourishment. And you can see that this area, they've already actually have started to do that. So the next, kind of moving on now, the Living Shoreline Decision Support Tool was the second major element that we contributed in this project. And so first of all, what is it? So it's an on-the-fly decision-making app that interacts directly with the user for data input. Therefore, there is no need for a robust GIS database to sit behind all of this. The advantage of the user input is that the data always remains current. And the real reason why we kind of moved towards this is that we've recognized kind of early on that data collection for this can be expensive. And then it's also timely. So it has a finite application in terms of time. So how frequently can you go in and actually keep it current can really be cost prohibitive to an area. And I don't know, maybe Leanne will talk a little bit later, or Haley, about, you know, the amount of time that it took for them to actually develop the data for their project. So just for the technical people out there who are interested, so the decision support tool uses the pathways that were developed for the living shoreline suitability model. So the same flow chart that I showed you earlier is the one that is used to help provide the guidance in the Q&A response for the decision support tool. Tammy uses JavaScript to basically program and interpret all the user responses. So that's really kind of the the engine behind all of this. HTML is used to build the website, and CSS gives it a little bit of characteristic and color, so forth on the web pages itself. So the goals of the decision support tool was that it would be flexible and compliant with ABA requirements. We wanted it to be query-based, so a Q&A kind of interface. It needed to have help support for the user, and we wanted it to be on the fly so that we would instantaneously, there could be a recommendation. And that we also wanted it to appeal to a broad stakeholder audience. So we have managed, or Tammy has managed to make it responsive and flexible. So it is ADA compliant. It operates on the desktop and on the mobile phone. It is query-based. So there are maybe 15 or maybe 20 different questions. I can't remember exactly. So the user comes into the interface after it goes through the launch page, and it's asked a series of questions that are intended to try and characterize the shoreline. So is the shoreline currently defended? If it is, what type of defense is in place? If it's not, you answer no. Then it answers a whole series of questions from the morphology. What's the bank height like? What's the length of the shoreline of interest that you're trying to manage? Is there a beach along the shoreline? So this is just this is a better view. So how high is the bank? Can it be graded? Yes or no? Is there an established marsh along the shoreline? So maybe the user doesn't really understand how to answer all these questions. So there is interactive help embedded throughout the entire Q&A, and that's what these question marks are. So if the user doesn't understand how to answer the question, they can hit on the question button, and then a little help will come up. So in this example here on the left, the user didn't understand how do they measure or determine what the bank height is, so they could click on there and an illustration may pop up. Here on the right-hand side is the user is asked to evaluate the exposure or the fetch of the shoreline. And so when the window pops up, there's a series of photographs and maps that help the user understand how to make that calculation, as well as what is the fetch. So once the user finishes answering all the questions, they hit the Submit Your Answer button, and then the recommendation pops up. So the recommendation here, so for this example, there is a summary of the answers to the questions that the user went through. The recommendation comes out right at the top. So this was an undefended shoreline. It had no beach or marsh, but it had high exposure. And so this was the recommendation that the decision tool returned, which was to maintain the beach, or really here it's for an offshore breakwater with beach nourishment. There's also a series of pictures that the user can click through if they're not familiar with what this type of structure is. There are just some examples of what they can expect. The one thing that this tool does not do is it is not a design tool, so it's not going to tell the user how to construct the offshore breakwater. It's going to tell that it is going to say a little bit about what beach nourishment is, its value, and how it functions in the landscape. Here's another example here. So this is another on-the-fly recommendation. In this case, the user answered the series of questions, which are summarized here. It was for an undefended shoreline that had a narrow marsh and moderate or high exposure. So in this case, the exposure answer was here, it was moderate. And the recommendation here was for a plant marsh with sill. There's a description here of what that means, what type of structure that actually is. The user can hit the show pictures, and then they can scroll through a series of pictures of what a marsh sill a planted marsh would look like. So that was really what I had to go through at this point. This is the link to the decision tool. I'm hoping that there's going to be another moment in either in the presentations today or follow up where you can get access to this link. My email and Tammy's email is here, and we appreciate any feedback on this. This tool is being vetted right now in several areas, including Virginia, Alabama, Louisiana, and now with this workshop, we hope it will be tried out and get some feedback in the Galveston Bay area. So that's really all I had. And I believe I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Leanne is going to introduce the model, the Living Shoreline Suitability Model activities for Galveston.
I am Leanne Wilde. I am the Living Shorelines Program Manager for Galveston Bay Foundation. And what I'm now going to talk to you about today is Galveston Bay Foundation's role in shoreline management in and around the Bay, as well as why we got involved with this model, which we were very excited to be a part of. My presentation coming after Marsh's is going to take us all back to kindergarten because she's so far ahead of me in terms of what she knows. But hopefully we can now all get through this together. So the Galveston Bay Foundation was founded in 1987 by just a few people who wanted to make the Bay a better place. Our mission now is to preserve and enhance Galveston Bay as a healthy and productive place for generations to come. And the vision we have is a future Galveston Bay that is brimming with life connected to people and contributing to the community in every possible way. So today we are managed by a 25-person board of directors that meets monthly. We are run by a staff of 28, including 3 full-timers and 5 part-timers, at least at the time I put this slide together. I know that changes. We're supported by about 4,550 members and roughly 2,000 volunteers annually. We're moving into new offices south of Kemah, Texas. We were set to move in right when the stay-at-home orders went into place, so a lot of us haven't seen our new offices yet, but are excited to do so. We'll be right on the bay, which will be exciting too. And our projects and programs span all around Galveston Bay, its subbays, and its tributaries. The Galveston Bay Foundation's focus areas or program areas are education, restoration, water protection, conservation, and advocacy. Today, we're going to mostly be talking about the restoration components, which involves restoring and protecting shoreline around the bay. That obviously impacts conservation as well, but we're going to focus mostly on restoration today. So some of our highlights, and basically my part of this presentation is to give Galveston Bay Foundation street cred. You know, we got to have some credibility, right? Why are we involved in this? Why do we know what we're doing? And so just for those who don't know anything about the foundation, we have protected and preserved over 20,000 acres around the bay. We've protected approximately 20 miles or almost 20 miles of shoreline. Over the years, with our signature Marsh Mania volunteer event, we've had over 8,100 citizens planting approximately 210 acres of marsh grass in over 20 consecutive years. So we do have a fantastic outreach component that gets people out into the bay, into the area. And my particular area and passion is living shorelines, which is working, or private landowner living shorelines, which is working with landowners to find more environmentally friendly ways or sustainable ways to protect their precious property from erosion. And we've completed over a dozen of those projects over the years. And the picture just shows you some of the areas where we've worked. Our habitat restoration program works both with large-scale protection and restoration, working along large stretches of shoreline, Like I mentioned, I work with private landowners on smaller projects. We also do wetlands restoration, which is sometimes part of the shoreline protection and sometimes separate from that. Oyster reef restoration, which again can be part of a shoreline protection plan, and sometimes it's independent. We do bird rookery restoration, marine debris removal, removing derelict vessels from the water. And we work with submerged aquatic vegetation, which most people refer to as seagrass, restoring that as well. So we are a broad spectrum organization. And just to give you an idea of the types of works and the locations of the work where we do it, you can take a quick glance at this slide. I actually stole this slide from someone else, so I will be quite honest and tell you, I have no idea what that purple dot in the upper right-hand corner is. Not a clue. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our bay or our estuary, and I'm going to get a little bit basic for some folks, but I was reviewing the people who said they were going to, who replied that they were attending this meeting. It's really, we've got people on here from all different walks. We've got regulatory folks, non-regulatory folks, city, county, local, state officials. We've got environmental professionals. We've got landowners. So I'm going to get a little basic here for some of you, but hopefully I'll provide some, hopefully a few of you will walk away with something you didn't know before. An estuary is the technical term for a place where the rivers meet the sea. And Galveston Bay, which is this big area here, has fresh water coming in from the San Jacinto and the Trinity rivers, as well as many smaller bayous and creeks and tributaries. And we have salt water that comes in here at Bolivar, up here at Rollover Pass, and down off the screen at San Luis Pass. An estuary is therefore a mix of salt and fresh water, which is called brackish water, and it makes it a really special place. Oysters thrive here. A large number of our commercially and recreationally important finfish and shellfish spend at least some part of their life cycle in the estuary. So estuaries in general are very special. Galveston Bay's estuary is, or Galveston Bay, the estuary, is very special because it is the largest estuary in Texas, the 7th largest in the United States. Fun fact that a lot of people don't know, it's only about 8 feet deep on average. And it's made up of 4 major sub-bays. We refer to the whole system as Galveston Bay, but in actuality, there's Galveston Bay, the sub-bay Galveston Bay, there's Trinity Bay, East Bay, and West Bay. And as I mentioned, I talked about the freshwater inflows coming from the San Jacinto and Trinity rivers, and then the tidal exchange or salt water coming in from the areas I discussed before. So I mentioned briefly, and this is just some pretty basic pictures, obviously, but just to give you an example of how some of the species that we rely on, such as blue crabs, flounder, redfish, the shrimp, which is a big commercial industry, they spend some part of their life in the bay itself. So again, that's really basic for a lot of you, and you're probably yawning, but for those who don't know and who just look at it and say, gosh, it's just a big brown body of water, it's really more than that, and it's worth protecting, and that's why we got involved with this model, and that's why we do what we do. So our watershed, just to give you, we've also got people on here from different states and from different areas, and so I don't want to assume people know anything. Like my college professors used to tell me, write your paper as if I don't know what you're talking about. So that's the approach I've taken today. Our watershed is large, 24,000 square miles. And for those of you not from Texas, we don't typically measure things in miles. We typically measure things in how long it takes to get there. So just to give you an example, I live down in this area. My parents live up here. That's about a 4.5-hour drive. So depending on what, you can look at it whichever way you want, but that's the Texan way. And about half of the population of Texas lives in the watershed. This portion of our state has a lot of people. This portion of our state, not so much. So a lot of folks can have an impact on the bay. The top issues we face down here are loss and degradation of habitat due to erosion primarily, reductions in wildlife populations. The slide says insufficient freshwater inflows, but some years we have a more than sufficient freshwater inflows, such as during hurricanes like Harvey and some of the floods we've had recently, which also causes problems of its own. If we don't get enough fresh water, the bay gets too salty. If we get too much fresh water, the bay gets too fresh. Obviously, we're also concerned about human health risks, and a lack of awareness of the importance of the bay is an issue we face. Today, we're going to focus mostly on the loss and degradation of coastal habitats due to erosion. And I want you to all be real impressed with my super fancy slide here. I know it's a technological work of art, but it gets the point across, I hope. During most of the year, we have prevailing southeast winds, which when they kick up can really give the shoreline a beating in that direction. But in the winter, we get northers, and when they come, they drive a lot of water out of the bay and force it out and hit the shoreline from the north. We also have the critically important Houston Ship Channel running through here, and when those giant ships come through, they push their bow wakes, which push energy off to the east and to the west. So basically, the bay gets hit by pretty heavy wave action from all directions most of the time. We pumped a lot of groundwater out from under the bay in early to mid part of the last century, and that caused the entire bay area to sink. When it sank, the shoreline got submerged, and the natural marsh grasses and vegetation that surrounded the bay were drowned out, and they were therefore not able to protect the shoreline as they did. So that just has left the shoreline even more vulnerable to erosion. So I'm going to go through this relatively quickly because I want Haley to really be able to get into the model itself. But this is just an example of some of the wind-driven erosion and ship wake erosion that can happen. This is over in the Trinity Bay area. This is an example of some erosion that happened after Hurricane Harvey over on the Clear Creek Channel. So that was floodwater driven. Although we could call it bird habitat potentially, right? There's a bird there. No? This is on Moses Lake and is an example of some wind-driven erosion that comes from those prevailing southeast winds as well as the northers that come through. And again, an example of high tide, wind-driven erosion and flood erosion that can happen. So we've seen a variety of different shoreline management techniques in the previous slides, some undefended shoreline where there was nothing in place, some where there were things in place that were failing. A very common shoreline management technique down here is either to put in something like this bulkhead here, or to put armoring such as rock or concrete directly on the shore. There are a large number of reasons that Galveston Bay Foundation does not recommend these types of shoreline treatments. However, we recognize that in some cases it's the only option. Shoreline management treatments that we tend to prefer are called living shorelines, like Marcia talked about, and they incorporate both natural and man-made components to more closely mimic what would actually happen in nature. So for example, in this case, you'll see a breakwater off the shore with marsh grass planted behind it. There are gaps in the breakwater to allow for critters and sediments and things like that to come in and out, to flow in and out naturally with the water. And this provides habitat for shrimp, crabs, fish, etc., as well as protecting the homeowner's shoreline or any shoreline. And Haley's going to talk a little bit about that as well. And like Marcia said, the model that Haley will be talking about momentarily does recognize that sometimes a solution like this is not possible, but we're a little biased. And when given the option, we would prefer to put in a living shoreline if we can. So just a little history briefly about how we got involved in this. and it has been mentioned before, it was a partnership with Troy University, the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, and the Geological Survey of Alabama. I tell you what, we are working with some high quality folks here. We were very honored to be a part of this. Chris mentioned it's funded by NOAA. Our agreement was signed in September of 2018, and the Galveston Bay Foundation project budget was $78,000. And as also has been mentioned, we were taking the existing Virginia model and adapting it to Galveston Bay. So Marcia mentioned talking about the time it took. I'm not sure we knew exactly what we were getting ourselves into when we started this. It certainly was educational and eye-opening for Haley and for me once we got started on this, and really can't thank Tammy and Marcia enough for the guidance and assistance that they gave. In fact, we ended up outsourcing some of the work back to Tammy from VIMS because we just realized that she was going to be able to do it far more efficiently than we were going to be able to. But all of that said, if we can do it, anyone can. So, you know, if you're contemplating doing something like this for your region, is certainly doable. And we are very pleased with the end result, which you will see very soon. End users have been mentioned several times now, so I'm not gonna go over that too much more. Just want to emphasize that for Galveston Bay, as with the other models, but we did take very specific Galveston Bay water body needs into account on this. Haley's going to talk about the data we got. She's going to talk about how we adapted the Virginia model to meet Galveston Bay's needs. But I just want to, I guess, reiterate that while we took another model from another state, this is very specific to Galveston Bay. Some of the comments that I got back on my RSVP request for this webinar said they were interested in learning more about the Bay. So I did include this slide so that if anyone wants to go, or not about the Bay, I'm sorry, about the foundation. So if anyone wants to go back or take a quick screenshot, get more involved, this is how you can do it. Again, it's addressing a specific comment or two that came up in the replies. So at this point, I am going to mute my microphone for real this time, stop sharing my screen, and turn it over to Haley for the model.
All right, everybody. So as Leanne and Chris mentioned, I'm Haley Leha, and I'm the Habitat Restoration Manager with the Galveston Bay Foundation. And so I was working with Leanne on actually developing the model kind of on the back end of things for Galveston Bay specifically. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on how we actually did that in ArcGIS. And don't be afraid, if you've never messed with GIS, you do not need any prior knowledge. Just wanted to give you an idea of how this was actually developed so that you have a better understanding of how and why it works the way that it does. All right, so first of all, the way this model was developed, and Marcia kind of hinted at here, we did base all of this off of the Virginia model. And so a lot of it has been adapted to suit Galveston Bay or Texas specifically. So the first thing we had to do is actually identify a variety of data categories that were essentially the input into the model itself and the associated references that go along with that data. The next step was actually digitizing the shoreline in ArcGIS, which I'll show you a little bit here in a minute. And then we worked with those flowcharts Marcia showed to actually guide the model outputs for what we wanted to see for the Galveston Bay model. And then, of course, last but not least, the amazing Tammy created the model in GIS as well as the web viewer I'm going to show you here in just a moment. So the first thing I wanted to touch on were the actual data categories that we looked at. These are basically all of the elements that need to be considered when determining how and why your shoreline or if your shoreline needs protection. So these are all the data categories where we went out and gathered this information or looked at aerial imagery to determine what was present at every single location along the Galveston Bay shoreline. So, you know, some of the things we took into consideration were the presence of existing marsh or oyster reef, if there were any structures on or offshore that need to be considered. And so this was looked at for the entire Galveston Bay estuary. All right, folks, are you still there? My computer's having some glitches. Sorry about that. So the next thing we did then was actually go in and digitize the shoreline itself. And this was done just simply by interpreting aerial imagery in ArcGIS. So Leanne and Tammy and I were utilizing ArcMap and basically using the 2015 Texas Earth Imagery Program, aerial photographs, as well as Google Earth imagery to look through the entire shoreline to identify all those different features. And we also pulled in reference data from groups like the Hart Research Institute, as well as other natural resource agencies to help guide us in identifying where specific items were located, such as oyster reefs, seagrass beds, that sort of thing. And you can find all of that in our metadata on the online model if you're curious. And of course, part of the reason the Galveston Bay Foundation was involved in developing this was because we do have staff on the ground frequently all throughout the Bay system. And so we're able to provide personal observations and ground truthing to back up some of this actual data. Now, the first step in digitizing was simply to establish what we called our base shoreline. So literally the outline of the entire Galveston Bay estuary. So just imagine taking a pencil and drawing on a map the entire edge of that shoreline where the water meets the land. Well, rather than doing that completely by hand in ArcGIS and taking 10 years just to get the first step done, we were able to pull in data from NOAA. They have an environmental sensitivity index and do have this coastal line actually already drawn out for us. Sorry again, bear with us. We're used to doing all of this in person. So I had just talked about the fact that we had to collect multiple different sources of data to be able to actually draw out this shoreline. So our first step was really actually delineating the Galveston Bay shoreline digitally, not actually on the ground. So rather than manually tracing this in the mapping software, we were able to pull in NOAA data, specifically the Environmental Sensitivity Index from 2013 that's available online. And then we modified that to make it more accurate for the Galveston Bay shoreline. So what you're seeing on the screen now, hopefully, that is our base shoreline that we use to then replicate for every single one of those different data categories. So each one of those data categories is essentially going to be each layer or each input that went into the model you're going to see online here in a minute. So the next step in this process was actually coding those lines to represent the different data categories. So for instance, what you should be seeing on my screen now is just a screenshot of what it looked like in ArcMap. So this, for example, is our land use category. So we wanted to know what the specific land use was at any location around Galveston Bay. So what we would actually do is go in and select each individual segment of the shoreline and code it to that specific location. So if you see right here where I've got highlighted in bright blue, that little segment is being coded as residential because we're looking at land uses in this specific reference layer. And so we went through every single inch of shoreline to code it appropriately for all 15 of those data categories. So this did take quite a bit of time. So I wanted to put up all of this information about those different data categories. Don't be afraid of it. It's just there if you're interested. But the reason I wanted to show this to you guys right now is because it gives you an idea of the different stipulations for each category. So for instance, things like bank heights, we had 3 different options. Or for oyster reefs or for seagrass, we wanted to only look at the presence of that habitat within 100 feet of shoreline. So there are a lot of specific technicalities for each of these data categories. And again, this will show up in the metadata online if you're curious about how we came to these conclusions. And like Marcia mentioned earlier, there were flowcharts developed to help guide the models to specific outputs for different situations. Again, I know this is kind of a scary thing to see on the screen. You don't need to memorize it for any reason. Just wanted to show you how we got to our outcomes. And so basically everything you see in green or gray, these are going to be the outcomes that actually pop up on your screen in the model, but in a much neater fashion. That was just kind of looking at the background. And then Marcia had also mentioned some of the different outcome categories. So what we had to do for Galveston Bay was more specifically define what we wanted to recommend for protecting your shoreline in terms of what is known here locally. So for instance, on the East Coast, like what we saw in the Virginia model, they use the term sills. That's not local terminology here. Most of the contractors we work with do not use that term. So we wanted to make sure that this was accurate for the Galveston Bay region. So those first 5 items listed, that is what you're going to see in the model. Anytime you click on a segment of shoreline, it's going to give you one of those recommendations. Now, there may also be a special situation where you get one of these other 6 considerations here, such as if there is existing marsh or another important aquatic habitat, you might get the message that says there's an ecological conflict, seek a local agency representative, and we provide that information as well. Now, before we actually get into looking at the model itself online, I did want to mention 2 important terms that we defined for the model itself, and something that we're hoping to use in more guidance documents for the Galveston Bay region and maybe even for the Texas coast. So these are the low profile breakwater and the high profile breakwater. This is typically the approach we use at the Galveston Bay Foundation along with our partners to protect shorelines and essentially create a living shoreline project. So for a low profile breakwater, all that means is that it's going to be a structure or wave break structure that's utilized in an area with lower wave and wind energy. It's more appropriate there because it's a smaller structure, typically 3 feet or less in height. And these structures are often made out of alternative materials like oyster shell, as you see in the picture here, sometimes reef domes, but it could also be limestone or concrete riprap. Now, on the other hand, a high-profile breakwater is what you're going to see on a larger scale project, typically in a higher energy environment, and this just basically means that it's going to be a structure that's greater than 3 feet in height. And these are usually constructed out of materials like crushed concrete or limestone riprap. And of course, in both of these situations, we always recommend planting both your intertidal zone as well as the upland bank habitat with native plant species. All right, so now on to the good stuff. This is the actual model that you will have access to online and is available to the public. Anyone is welcome to use this. We hope that it's useful to all of you. So you can actually copy this URL right here. The Galveston Bay Foundation will also be sharing the location of this on our website, so keep a lookout for that. But I just wanted to walk everyone through this viewer, just to give you an idea of where everything is located and how to use it. And you do not have to be well-versed in mapping or GIS by any means. This is a very friendly end-user interface. So the first thing I wanted to point out, in the upper right-hand corner, you're going to see this little information icon. Basically, anywhere on this mapping viewer that you see that, it's going to pop up with another block of information for you to view. So this one just simply gives you an overview of what this model was all about, how it was created, essentially what we're talking about here today. Now, more importantly, and probably what you're going to want to play with a little bit on your own, are the layers that you have options to view. So again, in the upper right-hand corner, you can find kind of these 3 sheets of paper, it looks like, and that will pop up your multiple layers you can select from. So the first one I want to guide you through is the actual model outcomes itself. So that would be your first drop-down option. And now we've separated this into 2 categories. This first one will show you all of the recommendations that are possible for this model. And so if you look on the right-hand side of my screen here, this is what will pop up, all these shoreline protection recommendations. And so these will all be present on the viewer. But if you want to know more about the definition of each one of those recommendations, you can click on the little eye icon once again, and the glossary defining each one of those recommendations will pop up. Now, if you're more curious about looking at individual recommendations, say for instance, you'd like to know where we recommend planting just marsh without any large structures, you can look at just that individually. So if my screen is working properly, fingers crossed, you should be able to see where I indicate that. And it's showing up in that little legend there. You can see the little green line that's showing you where all marsh planting has been recommended along the Galveston Bay shoreline. Now, we've also included on this viewer all of those data categories that I mentioned earlier. So every single type of category that we digitized, all of that data is also included here for your use. And we're hoping that that can be useful to a lot of the Natural Resource Agency folks, consultants, and even for our staff, we're already excited to be able to use some of this technology. So you'll see again in that upper right-hand corner, you'll be able to click on the Galveston Bay reference layers, and it'll open it up to all of those different categories. So just for an example, if you want to look at one category, you just need to make sure and have that box clicked on it. And if the legend for that specific category, like you're seeing here, boat ramps, does not appear, you just simply need to click on those three little lines to the right, and that'll bring up your legend. So in this case, it'll show you where all the boat ramps are located and which are private and which are public. And for another example, just looking through these reference layers, I showed you previously what this looked like in the ArcGIS as we were digitizing the land use layer, and now here it is in the actual model online. So this is what you'll be able to see. Now, of course, if you want more information on how we got to these conclusions, where we got our data, that sort of thing, every single one of those layers will have that little information icon. And if you click on it, it'll bring up your metadata page, and that'll tell you where we've sourced some of that information. So for example, for oysteries, we were able to source a lot of that data from Texas Parks and Wildlife and General Land Office. So all of that will be included in the metadata online. Now, let's say you want to search for a specific location. Maybe you're a homeowner and want to go directly to your address right on Galveston Bay. Well, you can type that in simply by clicking on the magnifying glass in the upper right-hand corner, and that'll bring up your search bar there in the left-hand corner, and you can type in your address. So for the purposes of today, just as an example, I typed in the address of our new KEMA headquarters. And you can see this property has had some severe erosion along the bayfront there. A lot of that is due to ship wake action, as well as the adjacent properties have been completely bulkheaded in. So let's say we want to know what to do at this location specifically to better protect our shoreline. All you do is simply click on that line, the actual shoreline itself, and you'll get a pop-up box like you see here that gives you your shoreline protection recommendation. So at this location, it's recommended that we construct a high-profile breakwater. So remember, that's a large-scale wave break with marsh planting. And good news, we're actually in the process of doing that. We have a contractor ready to go as soon as the pandemic allows. Now, if you want more information on a specific location like this, in that pop-up box, you can actually scroll through that definition. That's the same definition you're going to find in the glossary, but also you're going to be given the specific information for that site for every single one of those data categories. So you can see there it says shoreline is currently undefended, you have high exposure, the water depth there is shallow. So all of those different categories will be defined as well. If it's blank, it just means that that item is not present in that location. Now, last but not least, say, for example, you want to print some of this information for a report you're working on or just to save that data, you do have that ability. Up in that upper right-hand corner, there's a little image of a printer, and that'll give you access to actually exporting that map and image as a PDF. And this is the printout you should receive. And let's say you're ready to start over and look back at a different location. There's a home button in that left upper corner, and that'll just bring you back to the original view of the Galveston Bay viewer. Now, I was hoping to do all this online, actually in real time with you guys, but since we're having some glitches, this was just all through slide view, but please feel free to visit that URL and mess around with it some yourselves. And if you have further questions, Leanne and I are here to help you anytime. Feel free to email us, call Galveston Bay Foundation. You know, we do hope that this becomes a useful tool for everyone to use, both landowners, consultants, agency folks, even engineers. Hopefully this will come in handy for all of you guys. Thank y'all for bearing with me. And I will be transferring it over to Tammy now to talk a little bit more about the decision support tool.
Wow. All right. Well, in interest of time, I'm going to go pretty quick, and Marcia covered a lot of what I was going to talk about, so we'll just get right into it. Okay. So you all have seen the flowcharts. The decision support tool was created to provide preliminary guidance for what to do for eroding shorelines and shorelines that have failed or failing shoreline protection structures. Its design follows these flowcharts, as we've mentioned earlier, and these two are part of a set of 4 flowcharts that have been used to create the decision support tool. If you notice right up at the top, there are a couple questions that will, if answered yes, they will immediately stop the progression of the flowchart, and that's reflected in the tool itself. Recommendations are based on the user's response to no more than 13 questions that help to characterize the present shoreline condition. I'll show you the tool in just a moment, but first I wanted to give you the opportunity to open the tool on another device if you want to follow along. Chris shared the scan code for the tool, and the URL is shown on the bottom of the slide. It's also provided on the agenda. So we're just going to go down to the decision support tool. When you click on the URL or use the scan tool, you're presented with the decision support tool landing page. It has a brief introduction and a description on how to use it. It's also it's important to note that this is meant to provide guidance for shoreline erosion management. It's not a design tool. It's expected that the user will seek additional information from local regulatory agencies and technical advisors. At the bottom of, if you scroll down, this is all live. If you scroll down, there's this launch tool button. Simply click this and you'll get the decision support tool. It begins with 2 questions. The first one establishes whether your shoreline is hardened or not with an erosion control structure. The next one asks if it's part of a residential canal. If you skip a question or forget to answer a question, you will get something that highlights it and says, please answer this question, and it's not going to advance unless you do. As Marcia already mentioned, each question has a little help button that will provide information about the question and will help you decide your best answer. So in this case, it gives you a definition of what we mean by bulkheads and also riprap or revetment. You can scroll through the pictures by using the little arrows. There are also little buttons down here on the bottom that can be moved back and forth. To close it, you simply click the hide panel and it goes away. There are questions 2 through 5. You can get an immediate response if you answer yes or if you don't answer no. If you answer no to these questions 2 through 5, more questions will appear. So this one is looking for areas that are highly developed, such as marinas, defended shoreline along commercial or industrial areas, or shoreline that has a road, parking area, or railroad bed right next to it. The fourth question asks about ecological conditions such as SAV presence, mangrove presence, and sandspit. The fifth question asks about your bank height. And as Marcia showed you, there is some graphics there that will help you figure out how to measure bank height. So if you have answered all those questions as no, you'll get a suite of 6 more questions. Can the bank be graded? If not possible, then you would say no. So if you have a bank where a structure is close by, or even a very low bank, it may not need to be graded, so you would just say no. The help will give you some examples of bank height, grading a bank, and we'll talk about the slope and how to calculate the slope. There's also this before and after picture of a high bluff and what it looks like after it's been graded back. The length of shoreline is important for determining the type of erosion control structure proposed. It could be impractical to build a large structure on a short length of shoreline. So that's the primary reason why we're asking that question. If you have a marsh on your shoreline, a new question will pop up and ask how wide the marsh is. If there is a beach along the shoreline, it will ask if there is an existing growing field. Fetch is the distance across open water, so that the larger the fetch, the more likely there will be erosion from high wave energy. The help here gives some examples of the various types of fetch. Now we've broken that into 3 categories. So low fetch is from 0 to a half mile. Moderate fetch is from a half mile to 2 miles, and high fetch is greater than 2 miles. So if you scroll through the pictures, you'll see how we measure fetch. An easy way, if you need to know, is open Google Earth, and there's a little ruler tool. You can click one side where you're located and then stretch it across to measure the length of fetch. And then the last question deals with nearshore water depth. So the help will clarify what we mean by shallow and deep. If you measure 30 feet off your shoreline and you go down, if it's still less than 3 feet deep, then you've got a shallow area. If it's greater than 3 feet deep within that 30 feet, then it's deep. It also has some examples, other pictures showing the 1 and 2 meter contours. So if you answer all your questions, I'm purposely leaving this one blank, you click submit my answer, missed one. You get your results. The top line gives you some key factors that factor into the recommendation. The second line in big bold letters is your recommendation. Below that is a description of your recommendation. Many of these BMPs talk about planting marsh. So we have included 2 links that have a list of wetland plants. So Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center and NRCS's Plant Material Programs websites. To help visualize what this might look like, there are pictures provided in many of the recommendations. And then there's the list of the questions and your answers. And finally, at the very bottom, if you need more information, there's a link to agencies. So if you click that, it will open up a new tab and shows you by different states where you can go for more information. Right now, we only have 7 states listed, but I anticipate more will be coming online, and this will be added too. Up at the top on the right-hand side is a little print button. It'll print out the recommendation. If you have the picture open, it'll print that as well. And then to close it, you have this X button here. So let's just say I made a mistake. I misclicked something. So instead of moderate exposure, I really meant to say low. You can change your answer, go back, and now my answer is different. Expand marsh was my recommendation. And finally, down here in the lower left corner is this little reset button. If you click the reset button, it takes you right back to the beginning.